Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been good at keeping her composure under pressure. It was a skill that served her well during her 8 years in the Navy, from her early days as a communications specialist aboard destroyers in the Pacific Fleet to her current assignment at the Pentagon's Naval Communications Command. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when Admiral Rebecca Morrison would call out her tactical call sign in front of 200 of the Navy's most senior officers during what was supposed to be a routine recreational volleyball game. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in late September. Sarah woke at 0500 hours in her small apartment just outside Arlington, completed her usual 5-mile run along the Potomac, and arrived at the Pentagon by 0730. Her desk in the basement communications center was already buzzing with encrypted messages from fleet commanders across 7 time zones. As a senior communications officer, Sarah was responsible for coordinating secure communications between the Pentagon and active naval operations worldwide. It was demanding work that required absolute precision and the ability to process classified information at lightning speed. What most people didn't know about Sarah was that she had earned her current position through an unusual combination of technical brilliance and field experience. 3 years earlier, she had been serving aboard the USS Fitzgerald when a catastrophic communications failure during a joint exercise with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force had left the ship virtually blind in contested waters near the South China Sea. While senior officers scrambled to restore primary communications, Sarah had jury-rigged a backup system using spare parts and her knowledge of both American and Allied communication protocols. Her improvised solution not only restored contact with the fleet but also prevented a potential international incident when Chinese naval vessels approached their position. That incident had earned her a commendation and the attention of Admiral Morrison, then a captain serving as the Pacific Fleet's communications director. Morrison had personally recommended Sarah for advanced training in strategic communications and, eventually, for her current Pentagon assignment. But the 2 women had barely spoken since Sarah's transfer to Washington 18 months ago. The Admiral was now serving as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Warfare, a position that put her at the very top of the Navy's technology and intelligence hierarchy. The Pentagon's recreational facilities were located on the building's top floor, a fact that always amused Sarah given how many floors of sensitive operations lay beneath. The volleyball court was part of a larger fitness complex that served as an unofficial meeting ground for officers from all branches of the military. It was here, every Tuesday and Thursday evening, that rank often became secondary to athletic ability and competitive spirit. Sarah had joined the weekly volleyball games 6 months after arriving at the Pentagon, initially reluctant to socialize, but eventually won over by the camaraderie and the chance to decompress from the intensity of her work. She was a natural athlete, her reflexes honed by years of Navy training, and she had quickly become one of the more reliable players in the regular group. Tonight's game was special, though. It was the annual Pentagon Athletic Association tournament, and officers from throughout the building had come to watch or participate. The crowd was larger than usual, filled with admirals, generals, and senior civilian officials who rarely ventured into the recreational areas. Sarah recognized faces from briefings she had attended, people whose names appeared on the classified documents that crossed her desk daily. Admiral Morrison was among them, though she was in civilian clothes and seemed to be engaged in conversation with several other flag officers near the scorer's table. Sarah's team was leading 2-1, and the 4th set was tied at 24 points each. She was positioned at the back row, her usual spot when her teammate Jessica Martinez sent a perfect setup toward the net. Sarah moved forward, timing her jump perfectly as she prepared to deliver what she hoped would be the winning spike. The ball was at its highest point, suspended in the air above her outstretched hand, when Admiral Morrison's voice cut through the ambient noise of the gymnasium like a blade. It wasn't her name that the Admiral called, nor her rank and surname as military protocol would normally require. Instead, Morrison spoke her tactical call sign, the classified designation that only appeared in the most sensitive communications and operational orders. Nightingale 7. The Admiral's voice was clear and unmistakable, carrying easily across the court despite the crowd's chatter. The effect was immediate and startling. Sarah's concentration shattered as her hand made contact with the ball, sending it careening wildly into the net instead of across it. But more significantly, every conversation in the gymnasium seemed to pause simultaneously. Officers who had been laughing and chatting suddenly turned toward the court, their expressions shifting from casual interest to something approaching alert attention. Sarah landed awkwardly, her feet stumbling slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. Her tactical call sign was classified at a level that required special clearance even within the Pentagon. It identified her not just as a communications officer, but specifically as someone cleared for the Navy's most sensitive information warfare operations. The fact that Admiral Morrison had spoken it aloud, in a room full of people who might not have that level of clearance, was unprecedented. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer to Sarah. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes focused on her, some curious, others calculating. A few of the more senior officers present were already moving, not toward the door exactly, but shifting their positions in ways that suggested they were preparing to either stay for something important or leave quickly if necessary. Admiral Morrison stepped away from the group she had been speaking with and walked purposefully toward the court. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the kind of direct gaze that had earned her respect throughout the Navy's historically male-dominated leadership structure. Despite being in civilian clothes, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Miss Chen," Morrison said, using Sarah's civilian form of address, "I need to speak with you privately." "Now." Sarah felt her teammates' confused glances as she walked toward the net. Jessica was still holding the ball, as if unsure whether the game should continue. The scoreboard still showed 24-24, but it was clear that volleyball was no longer the primary concern in the room. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, her training taking over even as her mind raced to understand what was happening. Morrison gestured toward a door at the far end of the gymnasium, one that Sarah knew led to a corridor connecting to the main Pentagon building. As they walked, Sarah became aware of how many senior officers were now openly watching their movement. Some were reaching for their mobile phones, others were having quiet conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed near them. The corridor beyond the door was dimly lit and empty, a stark contrast to the bright, crowded gymnasium they had just left. Morrison waited until the door closed completely before speaking, and when she did, her tone was entirely different from the casual voice she had used earlier. "Lieutenant Chen, I apologize for the dramatic nature of this contact, but we have a developing situation that requires your immediate attention. Your specific skill set and clearance level make you one of only 3 people in this building qualified to assist with what we're dealing with." Sarah's mouth felt dry. In her 8 years of military service, she had never been approached in such a manner. Operations requiring her level of clearance typically came through official channels with proper documentation and advance notice. Whatever was happening now was clearly outside normal protocol. "What kind of situation, ma'am?" she asked. Morrison glanced back toward the gymnasium door, then looked directly at Sarah. "The kind that could affect fleet operations in 3 different theaters if we don't address it correctly, and the kind that may require you to cancel any plans you had for the next 72 hours. The weight of those words settled on Sarah like a heavy blanket. She thought about her desk in the communications center, about the routine messages and standard procedures that had filled her day just hours earlier. That world suddenly seemed very far away from wherever Admiral Morrison was about to take her. "I understand, ma'am," Sarah said, though she knew she didn't really understand anything yet. What do you need me to do?" Morrison's expression softened slightly, the first hint of warmth Sarah had seen from her since the strange encounter began. "I need you to trust me, Lieutenant, and I need you to follow me to a part of this building that doesn't appear on any public floor plans." As they began walking down the corridor, Sarah realized that the volleyball game, her teammates, and even her apartment with its familiar routines were all receding into a past that already felt distant and simple by comparison. Whatever lay ahead would require every skill she had developed during her Navy career, and possibly some she hadn't known she possessed. The corridor seemed longer than it should have been, and Sarah noticed that the doors they passed bore no identifying markings. Admiral Morrison's footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor, a rhythmic sound that seemed to be counting down toward something Sarah couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, the sounds from the gymnasium grew fainter with each step, until finally there was only the quiet hum of ventilation systems and the soft electronic chirping of security systems that Sarah was beginning to realize were far more sophisticated than anything she had encountered in her normal Pentagon assignments. Admiral Morrison stopped at an unmarked door and produced a key card from her pocket. As she held it near the reader, Sarah caught a glimpse of the card's surface. It was black, with no visible markings or text. She had never seen anything like it during her time in the building. The door opened with a soft hiss, revealing an elevator that definitely hadn't been there the last time Sarah had walked this corridor during daylight hours. Morrison gestured for her to enter first, and as Sarah stepped inside, she noticed that the elevator panel showed buttons for floors that shouldn't exist according to everything she knew about the Pentagon's layout. Morrison pressed a button marked with a symbol Sarah didn't recognize, and the elevator began to descend. Based on the time it took, they were traveling far below the building's official basement levels into spaces that Sarah was beginning to suspect were built for purposes very different from anything described in the standard Pentagon orientation materials. "Ma'am," Sarah said as the elevator continued its descent, "may I ask how many people know about whatever we're going to see?" The elevator opened into a world that defied everything Sarah thought she knew about the Pentagon. Instead of the standard government-issued fluorescent lighting and beige walls that characterized the rest of the building, she stepped into what could only be described as a high-tech operations center that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. Multiple large screens displayed real-time data from locations around the globe, while dozens of workstations hummed with activity despite the late evening hour. The space was vast, clearly extending well beyond the Pentagon's known footprint. Sarah estimated that the ceiling was at least 30 feet high, supported by sleek steel columns that disappeared into shadows above. The air carried the distinct smell of advanced electronics and the barely audible whir of powerful computer systems. This wasn't just a command center. It was a facility designed for operations that required technology far beyond anything Sarah had encountered in her regular Navy assignments. "Welcome to the Information Warfare Analysis Center," Admiral Morrison said, her voice taking on a tone that mixed pride with obvious concern. "This facility was established 3 years ago as part of a joint Pentagon and NSA initiative. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, it's where we monitor and respond to sophisticated cyber threats against U.S. naval operations worldwide." Sarah's eyes moved across the room, taking in details that her training had taught her to notice. At least 20 people were working at various stations, most in civilian clothes, but moving with the purposeful efficiency of military personnel. The screens displayed information that she could partially recognize: satellite feeds, communication intercepts, and what appeared to be real-time tracking of naval vessels across multiple ocean regions. "Ma'am, what kind of threat are we dealing with?" Sarah asked, her voice automatically dropping to the subdued tone that classified environments seemed to require. Morrison led her toward a cluster of workstations near the center of the room. As they walked, Sarah noticed that several of the technicians looked up from their work to watch them pass. Their expressions ranged from curious to concerned, and she got the distinct impression that her presence here was unexpected, even by the people who worked in this secret facility regularly. 48 hours ago, Morrison began, our monitoring systems detected anomalous communications traffic originating from what appeared to be routine commercial shipping in the South China Sea. Initially, our analysts classified it as normal maritime radio chatter, cargo manifests, weather reports, the kind of routine communication that happens thousands of times daily in busy shipping lanes. They stopped at a workstation where a young man in his 20s was analyzing what looked like audio waveforms on multiple monitors. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and had the slightly pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time in underground facilities without natural light. "This is Dr. Marcus Webb," Morrison said. "He's the analyst who first identified the anomaly. Marcus, show Lieutenant Chen what you found." Dr. Webb looked up from his screens with an expression that mixed excitement with obvious worry. "Lieutenant, what I'm about to show you represents the most sophisticated communications deception we've encountered since I've been working in this field. And I've been doing this for 8 years. He gestured to his primary monitor, which displayed what looked like a standard audio frequency analysis. These are recordings of supposedly routine radio communications between cargo ships in the South China Sea over the past week. On the surface, they appear completely normal. Ship captains discussing weather conditions, port schedules, cargo manifests. Standard maritime communication protocols. Sarah leaned closer to examine the display. The waveforms looked exactly like what she would expect from routine ship-to-ship radio traffic. "What made you think they weren't routine?" "Initially, nothing," Webb admitted. "These communications would have been archived as normal background traffic if our artificial intelligence monitoring systems hadn't flagged a subtle pattern in the timing and frequency variations. Something that would be virtually impossible for human analysts to detect without computer assistance." He switched to a different display that showed the same audio waveforms, but with additional analytical overlays highlighting specific patterns. When we applied advanced frequency analysis and looked at the timing patterns of these communications, we discovered that they contained a secondary layer of encoded information. Someone has been using routine maritime radio traffic as a carrier wave for highly sophisticated encrypted messages. The implications of what Webb was describing began to sink in. Sarah had encountered communication deception techniques during her Navy training, but what he was showing her represented a level of sophistication that suggested state-level capabilities. "Who's sending these messages?" she asked. Admiral Morrison answered that question. "That's what we're still trying to determine. The apparent source locations match legitimate cargo vessels, but we have reason to believe that either those ships have been compromised or someone is using technology that can mimic their radio signatures perfectly." Morrison gestured toward another section of the operations center, where a different team of analysts was working with what appeared to be satellite imagery. "We've been able to identify approximately 47 separate communication events over the past 2 weeks. The encoded messages within these communications appear to contain detailed information about U.S. naval vessel movements, including some ship positions that should only be known to people with very high-level security clearances." The word clearances hit Sarah like a physical impact. If someone was transmitting classified information about fleet positions using this sophisticated technique, it meant that the leak was coming from within the U.S. military's own communication systems. This wasn't just espionage, it was espionage that required access to some of the Navy's most closely guarded operational information. "Ma'am, are you saying we have a security breach in our own communication networks?" Sarah asked. "That's one possibility," Morrison replied. "But there's another explanation that's potentially more concerning. We think someone may have found a way to intercept and decode our most secure communication channels in real time. If that's true, It means that communications we believe are completely secure may actually be compromised at the highest levels. Dr. Webb interrupted with obvious excitement. Lieutenant, this is where your specific expertise becomes crucial. The encoded messages we've identified use a communication protocol that combines elements of U.S. Navy tactical communication procedures with what appears to be a modified version of the encryption algorithms used by our most secure satellite communication systems. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Her work at the Pentagon had given her deep familiarity with exactly those types of communication protocols and encryption systems. If someone was using Navy communication procedures as part of their espionage operation, she might be one of the few people qualified to understand how they were doing it. Morrison continued the briefing. Lieutenant, your combination of field experience with Navy communication systems and your current access to our most advanced encryption protocols makes you uniquely qualified to help us solve this problem. We need someone who can analyze these intercepted messages from the perspective of someone who understands both how our systems work and how they might be compromised. They moved to a secure workstation that had been configured specifically for Sarah's use. The screens displayed copies of the intercepted communications, along with analysis tools that she recognized from her advanced training. But as she began to examine the data, she realized that the situation was even more complex than Admiral Morrison had described. "Ma'am," Sarah said after several minutes of analysis, "I'm seeing patterns in these communications that suggest something beyond just interception of our secure channels. Some of these encoded messages contain information that wouldn't be available through normal communication intercepts, even if someone had completely broken our encryption." Morrison leaned closer. "What kind of information?" "Maintenance schedules, crew rotation plans, detailed cargo manifests for supply ships. Information that exists in our computer systems but isn't typically transmitted via radio communication at all. If someone has this level of detailed information about fleet operations, they either have access to our internal computer networks or—" Sarah paused, unwilling to voice the alternative explanation. "Or what, Lieutenant?" "Or they have someone inside our organization with access to fleet operational planning systems. Someone with clearance levels high enough to access information from multiple commands simultaneously." The implications of what Sarah was suggesting settled over the group like a dark cloud. If she was correct, they weren't just dealing with sophisticated electronic espionage, they were potentially dealing with a highly placed insider who was providing classified information to unknown parties using communication techniques that were nearly impossible to detect. Dr. Webb looked up from his own analysis station. "Lieutenant, there's something else you need to see. We've been tracking the timing of these communications, and there's a pattern that suggests whoever is orchestrating this operation has real-time access to U.S. fleet movement orders." He displayed a new chart that showed the timing of the intercepted messages overlaid with actual fleet movement schedules. These encoded communications have been occurring within hours of major fleet repositioning orders being issued from various command centers. It's as if someone knows about planned operations before they're actually carried out. Sarah stared at the display, her mind racing through the implications. If the timing correlation was accurate, it meant that someone with access to operational planning was providing information that could potentially allow hostile forces to anticipate U.S. naval movements before they occurred. How many people would have access to the level of information that's been compromised? Morrison asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing here, whoever is responsible would need access to operational planning systems from at least 4 different command centers: Pacific Fleet, European Command, Central Command, and probably Pentagon-level strategic planning. That combination of access would be limited to a very small number of people." "How small?" Morrison pressed. "Maybe 50 people worldwide, ma'am, and most of those would be flag officers or very senior civilian officials." The weight of that assessment hung in the air. They were potentially looking for a traitor at the highest levels of the U.S. military command structure, someone with access to information that could compromise fleet operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. Morrison looked at her watch, an expression of urgency crossing her face. "Lieutenant, we have a complication that makes this situation even more critical. In 14 hours, the Pacific Fleet is scheduled to begin a major exercise involving joint operations with Japanese and Australian naval forces. If whoever is behind these communications has advanced knowledge of that exercise, they could position assets to monitor or potentially interfere with the operation." Sarah understood immediately. A compromised military exercise involving allies could damage relationships that had taken decades to build, while providing potential adversaries with detailed information about how the U.S. Navy operated with its closest partners. "What do you need me to do, ma'am?" Morrison's expression was grim but determined. "Lieutenant, I need you to use your knowledge of Navy communication systems to help us trace the source of these leaks. We have less than 14 hours to identify how this information is being compromised and stop it before it can affect the exercise." Sarah looked around the high-tech facility, at the analysts working urgently at their stations, and at the displays showing real-time naval operations around the globe. 12 hours ago, she had been worrying about routine communication traffic and looking forward to a casual volleyball game. Now she was being asked to help identify a potential traitor who could compromise U.S. naval operations on a global scale. "I understand, ma'am. Where do we start?" Admiral Morrison gestured toward a secure workstation that had been configured with access to communication logs from multiple fleet commands. "We start by doing something that's never been done before, analyzing every high-level communication related to tomorrow's exercise to see if we can identify exactly when and how the information is being leaked." As Sarah sat down at the workstation, she realized that the next several hours would either result in identifying one of the most damaging security breaches in recent Navy history or confirming that U.S. naval communications had been compromised in ways that could affect military operations for years to come. Either way, her quiet life analyzing routine communications traffic was officially over. Admiral Morrison looked at her reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors. "Including you, Lieutenant? As of tonight, exactly 17. Sarah had been analyzing communication patterns for 6 straight hours when she found it. Not the smoking gun everyone was expecting, but something far more subtle and, in its own way, more disturbing. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, and her eyes burned from staring at screens filled with data that would have looked like meaningless numbers to most people. But to Sarah, those numbers were starting to tell a story that no one in the Information Warfare Analysis Center had anticipated. "Admiral Morrison?" Sarah called across the operations floor, her voice carrying a note of urgency that immediately caught the attention of everyone within hearing distance. "I think you need to see this." Morrison approached quickly, followed by Dr. Webb and 2 other analysts who had been working on parallel investigations throughout the night. The main display screen at Sarah's workstation showed what appeared to be a complex network diagram with connecting lines between various communication nodes. "What am I looking at, Lieutenant?" Morrison asked. Sarah pointed to specific patterns highlighted in red on her display. "Ma'am, I've been analyzing the timing and routing patterns of all classified communications related to tomorrow's exercise. I was expecting to find evidence of someone intercepting or redirecting communications, but that's not what's happening." She switched to a different view that showed communication flow patterns over the past 2 weeks. "The leak isn't coming from someone with high-level access stealing information and transmitting it externally. Instead, someone has been subtly modifying the routing protocols of our secure communication systems so that copies of specific messages are automatically forwarded to external recipients without leaving any obvious trace." Dr. Webb leaned closer to examine the data. "That's impossible." Our secure communication systems have multiple layers of verification and encryption. You can't just redirect messages without triggering security alerts. Under normal circumstances, you're absolutely right, Sarah replied. But look at this. She highlighted a series of what appeared to be routine system maintenance logs. For the past 3 months, there have been a series of minor software updates and patches applied to communication routing systems across multiple commands. Each update was properly authorized and appeared to address legitimate security or performance issues. Morrison studied the patterns Sarah was showing them. Are you saying someone has been using legitimate system maintenance as a way to install unauthorized communication forwarding? That's exactly what I'm saying, ma'am. But it's more sophisticated than simple message forwarding. Whoever did this has been incrementally modifying the routing algorithms so that only specific types of messages, ones containing certain keywords or originating from particular sources, get copied to external destinations. Sarah switched to another display that showed the technical details of the modifications. The genius of this approach is that it doesn't involve breaking encryption or intercepting communications in the traditional sense. Instead, the system itself has been programmed to voluntarily share specific information, but only with recipients who know the exact parameters that trigger the forwarding. The implications of what Sarah was describing began to register with everyone present. This wasn't just espionage. It was espionage that had been built into the U.S. Navy's own communication infrastructure through what appeared to be legitimate administrative channels. "Lieutenant," Morrison said, her voice tight with concern, "are you telling me that our own communication systems are automatically sharing classified information with unauthorized recipients?" "Yes, ma'am. And based on the sophistication of these modifications, whoever implemented them has extremely detailed knowledge of Navy communication protocols and system architecture. This level of access and technical knowledge would require someone who either works directly with communication systems development or has administrative access to multiple fleet communication networks." Dr. Webb was rapidly typing commands at his own workstation, pulling up additional technical data. "Lieutenant Chen, if you're right about this, we should be able to trace the external destinations where these copied messages have been sent." Sarah nodded and began working to identify the external recipients. After several minutes of analysis, she discovered something that surprised everyone in the room. The external forwarding addresses aren't going to foreign intelligence services or known hostile entities, she announced. They're going to a private technology company called Maritime Solutions International. According to their corporate registration, they provide communication and logistics support services to commercial shipping companies. Morrison frowned. "I've never heard of that company. Have we had any official contact with them?" Dr. Webb was already pulling up information about Maritime Solutions International on his secondary monitor. According to public records, they're a legitimate company based in Singapore that provides communication infrastructure support to commercial shipping operations throughout the South China Sea region. They've been in business for 5 years and have contracts with dozens of major shipping companies. But Sarah was seeing something different as she dug deeper into the communication patterns. "Ma'am, I think Maritime Solutions International is more than just a commercial service provider. Based on the technical sophistication of the system modifications and the specific types of information being forwarded to them, I believe they're either working for a foreign intelligence service or they are a foreign intelligence operation disguised as a legitimate business." She displayed a new analysis, showing the correlation between information forwarded to Maritime Solutions International and the subsequent encoded communications that had been detected in South China Sea shipping traffic. "The timeline matches perfectly," Sarah explained. "Classified information about fleet movements gets automatically forwarded to Maritime Solutions International, and within hours, encoded versions of that information appear in the commercial shipping communications that Dr. Webb identified. They're using their legitimate business relationships with shipping companies as cover for an intelligence operation." Admiral Morrison studied the evidence Sarah had compiled. This explains how they've been able to coordinate their intelligence gathering with what appears to be routine commercial maritime activity. If they have contracts with shipping companies throughout the region, they could direct specific vessels to be in position to monitor U.S. naval operations based on advanced knowledge of our plans. The scope of what they were dealing with was becoming clear. This wasn't just electronic espionage. It was a coordinated intelligence operation that used legitimate business relationships to position assets for gathering information about U.S. naval operations across one of the world's most strategically important maritime regions. Lieutenant, Morrison continued, can you determine who had the access necessary to implement these communication system modifications? Sarah had been dreading this question because the answer was going to be uncomfortable for everyone involved. She pulled up logs showing the authorization history for all the system modifications that had enabled the information forwarding. Ma'am, all of the modifications were implemented using administrative credentials belonging to Captain Robert Hayes, who serves as Deputy Director of Fleet Communication Systems at Naval Network and Space Operations Command. However, based on the technical sophistication and the timing of the implementations, I don't believe Captain Hayes implemented these modifications himself. Morrison's expression darkened. What makes you think that? The modifications required specialized knowledge of communication routing protocols that go beyond what would be typical for someone in Captain Hayes's position. Additionally, the timing of the implementations correlates with periods when Captain Hayes was documented as being on leave or attending conferences away from his normal duty station. Dr. Webb looked up from his analysis station. Are you saying someone else has been using Captain Hayes's credentials to modify Navy communication systems? That's exactly what I'm saying, Sarah replied. Someone with administrative access to Captain Hayes's credentials and with advanced knowledge of Navy communication system architecture has been using his authorization to implement these modifications when he wouldn't be available to notice unauthorized activity on his accounts. Admiral Morrison was already reaching for a secure phone. We need to contact Captain Hayes immediately and determine whether he's aware that his credentials have been compromised. While Morrison made arrangements to contact Captain Hayes, Sarah continued analyzing the technical implementation of the communication modifications. What she discovered made the situation even more concerning. Admiral Morrison, Sarah called out, I found something else. The system modifications include what appears to be a self-destruct mechanism. If someone tries to remove or disable the unauthorized forwarding protocols without using a specific deactivation sequence, the modifications are designed to corrupt critical communication routing databases. Morrison ended her phone call and turned back to Sarah. What would that mean for fleet communications? It would mean that attempting to fix this problem incorrectly could disrupt secure communications across multiple fleet commands for weeks or possibly months. Whoever designed this system understood that we would eventually discover it, and they built in a way to cause maximum damage if we tried to remove it without their cooperation. The room fell silent as the full implications of the situation became clear. They had identified a sophisticated intelligence operation that had compromised U.S. Navy communications at a fundamental level, but attempts to fix the problem could potentially cause even more damage than allowing it to continue. Dr. Webb broke the silence. There has to be a way to safely disable these modifications without triggering the self-destruct mechanism. Sarah nodded, her mind already working on potential solutions. There is, but it requires understanding the exact technical implementation well enough to reverse engineer the deactivation sequence. It's possible, but it would take time. Morrison checked her watch. Lieutenant, the Pacific Fleet exercise begins in 4 hours. Do we have enough time to safely disable this system before then? Sarah considered the question carefully. Ma'am, I believe we can do it, but I'll need access to the actual communication routing systems, not just the analysis tools we have here. And I'll need technical support from people who work directly with the affected systems. Done, Morrison said without hesitation. What else do you need? I need Captain Hayes to be available to verify his credentials and provide technical details about his systems. And I need someone to coordinate with Maritime Solutions International to determine whether they're willing to cooperate or whether we're dealing with a hostile intelligence operation. Morrison was already making arrangements. Captain Hayes is being flown here from Norfolk and should arrive within 2 hours. As for Maritime Solutions International, we're coordinating with the State Department and our allies in Singapore to determine their exact status. Sarah turned back to her workstation and began the complex process of reverse engineering the communication modifications. It was going to require every skill she had developed during her Navy career, plus some improvisation that would have made her instructors nervous during her technical training. 3 hours later, Sarah successfully disabled the unauthorized communication forwarding system without triggering any of the self-destruct mechanisms. The process had required coordination between multiple technical teams, careful analysis of thousands of lines of system code, and precise timing to ensure that the modifications were removed safely. As the Pacific Fleet exercise began on schedule, Maritime Solutions International was quietly taken into custody by Singaporean authorities acting on information provided by U.S. intelligence services. The investigation eventually revealed a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been gathering information about U.S. naval activities for over 2 years. Captain Hayes's credentials had been compromised during a conference he had attended in Taiwan 18 months earlier, where foreign intelligence operatives had gained access to his computer systems through what appeared to be a routine hotel internet connection. Sarah returned to her regular duties at the Pentagon's Communications Command, but her role had fundamentally changed. She now served as a special advisor on communication security, with responsibility for identifying and preventing similar sophisticated attacks on Navy communication systems. The volleyball games continued every Tuesday and Thursday evening, but Sarah found that she could never quite look at routine activities the same way after learning how quickly ordinary moments could transform into extraordinary responsibilities. Admiral Morrison later wrote in Sarah's performance evaluation that her combination of technical expertise and analytical thinking under pressure represented exactly the kind of capabilities that the Navy needed to address emerging threats in an increasingly complex technological environment. But for Sarah, the most important lesson from the experience was simpler. In a world where sophisticated threats could hide within routine activities, the ability to recognize patterns and ask the right questions was often more valuable than advanced technology or high-level clearances. 6 months later, when the Navy implemented new communication security protocols based partly on Sarah's recommendations, she realized that her moment of mid-serve surprise in the Pentagon gymnasium had led not just to solving one crisis, but to strengthening the Navy's defenses against similar threats in the future.